interesting sermon, because once again it's in response to the treatment of Roman Catholics in England and the fear that the Catholics might come back and take over the country and reestablish the horrific period under, what was it, Queen Anne, when many people were slaughtered. And there's no record of him ever having preached this sermon. It was written in 1750, most people, Wesley scholars, believe. But there's no record of him ever having preached this sermon. But it talks about casting out devils. And the theme of the sermon is this notion of casting out devils. And bigotry, in Wesley's view, is a kind of devil that gets a hold of us, where we think we're right and everyone else is wrong. And we become bigots, as it were. We become a victim of our own opinions, uninformed opinions. And therefore we assume things about others that are basically unfair. And the political and social framework of England at that time was certainly thinking that way towards Catholics. It was a kind of, uninformed racism, if there could be such a thing, that was occurring throughout England at the time. And Wesley was concerned that Methodists didn't engage in that kind of thing. Bigotry, he felt, was an extremely dangerous position to take, because you could be wrong. And besides, the damage that bigotry did to other people was enormous. So he didn't want Methodists to participate in the practice of bigotry. So he said, we need to be cautious. We need to not reject people because they may be different from us.
And that is an element that would have applicability in every age and stage of Methodist development. One thinks of the recent debates on homosexuality within the church. That there has been, on the part of some, a stigmatisation of people who are gay or lesbian.
Exactly. But also Wesley didn't want Methodists to be sectarian. He didn't want them to be filled with what he called the party spirit. They're not of our party, therefore we don't want to associate with them. You see that today in the policies of the exclusive brethren, for instance. This attempt to separate oneself from the world in which we live, and in a sense based on the premise that maybe for some reason we're better than they are, and therefore it's better if we don't associate with them because they'll taint us. Yeah.
Wesley's whole life, in fact, is very much a going out into the world.
It is. Yeah. It's not a withdrawing into a fortress or citadel mentality of Christianity, which some churches like to have. It's basically opening your arms and embracing the world and seeing where that will take you.
Later on in life, he joined forces with Wilberforce, or at least gave a lot of moral encouragement to Wilberforce to keep the fight up against slavery.
Oh yes, in fact, that wonderful letter he wrote in 1790 to William Wilberforce is a classic.
Was that his last letter before he died?
It was one of the last letters, not the last one, but it's certainly shortly before he died. But it's a classic defense of, and he compares Wilberforce to Athanasius against the world, Athanasius contra mundum, and he says, he encourages Wilberforce to get rid of that villainy, he calls it, that has enslaved the world, that England should not be involved in the slave industry. But even before that, in 1789, I think it was, there was a thing called the Gordon Riots. The British Parliament introduced laws which effectively disallowed anybody who was Roman Catholic from participating in the political and social life of the country. And there was a man by the name of Sir John Gordon who led a movement of protest against those laws and finally got them repealed. That created havoc. There were riots, and there were 4 days of riots in London over that. Gordon was vilified and thrown into prison, but he was eventually forgiven for what he had done, and became kind of a hero of England at the time. And it was in that same year that Wesley wrote his classic letter, A Word to a Protestant, in which he basically, argued against bigotry and supported Gordon in Gordon's initiatives to overthrow what he felt was this terrible legislation that Parliament was trying to put into effect to contain Catholics in English society.
So if we were looking at the church today and the applicability of Wesley's sermon, A Caution Against Bigotry, what would be the demons that we might want to name today?
Well, we have our fair share of them today. The whole debate over gay lesbian leadership is one example, but I mean, and the Presbyterians, I think, personally have dug themselves into a hole by extending that to de facto relationships. What do you do in a parish if you have an elder who's been 25 years in the parish as an elder, whose wife's left him, and he's now moved in with somebody else, and they have a happy, mutually satisfying relationship? Do you say he can't serve as an elder? And that's one of the demons.
There were, besides demons in the church of our own making, there were the world's demons too.
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that perhaps the Methodist Church, in its attempt to be as inclusive as possible, has lost some of its capacity to name demons in society, like the demons of war or the demons of racism?
Yeah. That's always the danger, it seems to me. You walk a fine line. Wesley did say that when he was talking about caution against bigotry, he just said, this is not indifference. This does not mean that Methodists should be indifferent to what happens in their society. They should stand up for what they believe is right and true and just. But they have to do it in a way that is loving and embracing and seeks to understand what's going on. I think what's really interesting recently, I'm thinking about writing something in Touchstone about this, is the contrast between the Amish, the way they treated this man who shot and killed, was it 4 Amish girls, and then shot himself. And the Amish come out of a very conservative theological framework. But within hours after that happened, the local bishop of the House Amish community there went to the family, grieving the wife of the man who did this, and forgave her. And they attended in large numbers the funeral of the man who did the killing. It takes extraordinary grace and love to do that. But the Amish have always had a strong peace and justice tradition. And I think, the Methodists need to think about this. You compare this with other cases where there's been something terrible that's happened, and families are unprepared to even think about forgiving the offender. But how do we ever move forward unless we can move beyond the hurt and pain of a situation like that and try to come to a new understanding of why it happened and so on.